All right. Okay. So let's get started. First things first. Let's go back to the definition of incident response. So as a reminder, incident response is the process of preparing for, detecting, and responding to a cybersecurity threat. I would add it is also resolving the incident threat. Now, why this is really important is because it is one of the most critical parts of cybersecurity. When people think cybersecurity, they don't think about all the proactive work we've done, all secure coding, having a security by design, making sure that the culture is security minded. Instead, they first think of is a hack. So the first thing that happens in relation to a hack is, all right, a company got hacked. How did they respond? How did they resolve it? What data did they lose? So all of this is in relation to incident response. And every single organization has to face the concept of an incident. Now, keep in mind, like I mentioned before, an incident doesn't mean that you got breached and then you lost a whole ton of data. An incident can be an employee accidentally sending their passport information instead of HR to the manager of sales. That is considered an incident and that does have to be reported. So you need to have a process and a plan and certain technology in place to be able to respond to that as quickly and efficiently as possible. Why? Because there are several consequences to that. One of them is, which is we're going to talk about today, can be legal. We'll talk a little bit about chain of custody and how you, as a cybersecurity professional, might have to sit in a court of law to tell the judge and the jury what you found. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. Now, there are a lot of things in incident response that need to happen. For one, we need to talk about all the technical actions that need to take place. Then we need to talk about the communication procedures that need to take place. So when something goes wrong, we need to know what happened as well as what do we do and how do we talk about it. The how do we talk about it isn't spoken about enough because a lot of people tend to skip over that. They tend to not really focus on that bit. But it's just as important because the entire goal of the incident response process is to minimize the damage, to contain it, and to recover as quickly as possible. Now, those are the two main elements that we need to do is to minimize the damage and recover as quickly as possible. The third thing that is most, I would say, is like one of the things that is skipped over a lot is to learn from what happened and improve from it. We'll talk about what lessons learned means in this context. So if I were to have you remember anything about the incident response process, I want you to understand that it is the incident response process is having a prepared plan to be able to detect and respond to when an incident happens. Now, we tend to say it's very technical, which is very true, but in this lesson, we'll learn all the macro elements of it. What communication needs to happen? How do we recover? How do we learn from this entire process? A really good incident response plan kind of combines both. So you might be wondering, okay, well then what exactly is the incident response process? So we'll probably spend a good chunk of time on this. Now, there typically are about 5 steps when it comes to incident response. Now, some other places, like the one I showed you last time, CompTIA, they have 7, but all of these kind of have their same typical process. Okay, so you have preparation, and then you have detection, containment, recovery, and post incident. Now, this could be considered the entire incident response life cycle from start to finish. You'll notice that the start isn't detection. The start is actually preparation. This is all the proactive work you have to do before you can actually take all the other steps. I would dare to say, without the preparation steps, all the rest of the incident response lifecycle is useless. So we'll break down each of these one by one. The first one is preparation. So the preparation phase is really centered on building your incident response team. You remember I talked about the CSIRT team, the cybersecurity incident response team, how they involve a bunch of different people. It is not just the IT and security team. It can involve legal, it can involve marketing, it can involve sales, it involves account management. All of these different team members have to be I have to be involved in some way, shape, or form, especially if it's involving their product or their department. Additionally, you have the stakeholders that have to be considered. These stakeholders tend to be people that are like CEOs, CISOs, or even board of directors that need to be informed if there's been a hack. With all of the building process, you need to make sure that we're defining who's doing what. One of the key elements is knowing if an incident takes place, who exactly is the person that reports it? Who creates the Slack channel? Who lets the leadership know? This is a really important piece to make sure you define the roles specifically. Now, in addition to defining the roles, you need to create the right tools. You need to create the right policies. You need to create the right training so that all those team members, A, know what to do, which is what the training does, and then knows the right procedures and where to find the procedures, which is what the policies are, and knows what tools to use in order to respond to the incident. So all of these are elements that are in preparation, and they all surround the concept of being proactive, knowing how to communicate, knowing how to escalate, who to escalate to. The preparation piece is one of the most vital elements of incident response because you then have a really strong foundation. Think of it as this. It's like setting up when you're doing the preparation phase, you're setting up fire alarms, you're setting up exit plans, and you're training people on what to do. In the case of a fire, every building has to have a fire protocol. So everyone knows that they don't take the elevators when there's a fire, they take the stairs. That's because we've all been trained to know that that is the safer way to exit a building in case of a fire. We know that if there's an earthquake, we go under the desk. These are all proactive things that you do in the preparation phase when doing incident response. So let's just pretend that we as an organization, we've done all the preparation. We've prepped everything ahead of time and everything is all set. Well, in that case, then we go into the detection and analysis phase. Now, the detection and analysis phase that can be split up into different phases depending on which incident response framework you're going with. But in essence, its entire goal is to identify that an incident has occurred, that an incident happened. So when we know that an incident happened, well, then we can then start to go through the prioritization process. We look, okay, I think this incident happened. We need to validate it. We need to confirm it. We need to understand it. We need to know what products have been impacted. The way you do this is by analyzing a bunch of logs. You analyze network traffic and you analyze any security alerts. These are all tools that you have in your arsenal that you prepared ahead of time to be able to see any deviation from the baseline, any unusual behavior. So when you do this, you confirm that is an actual incident, and then you understand the scope. So when you notice these strange activity on your network, you need to ask yourself, is this a real threat? Is this a false positive? Is this a misconfiguration? Did we miss something? Okay. Now, with the detection and analysis phase, it's really important because when you detect something, you should be on alert and be ready in case it's an actual incident. You'll find that in the Security Operations Center, there's never a time where someone's just going to be lazily clicking on something and saying, oh, that's not an incident. I'm not going to look into it. The people in the Security Operations Center are very serious. I'll tell you an example when I worked at Rook Security. So at Rook Security, there were a lot of things that I saw that were just astounding. Let's see, what year is it? Trying to see if my NDA is elapsed. It is not. So I can't talk about this just yet. But in essence, the Security Operations Center, anytime a threat comes through, well, then they are fully alert. Like they're fully alert. If someone calls in, if they see some network traffic, well, then they had a system where the person would review it, they would do their own analysis of it. And then if it were something that were important, they would reach out to the manager, either call them, have them on Slack, tell them to come to their desk, explain to them what happened. And then the manager would then say, okay, that is an incident. Go ahead and deploy countermeasures, right? Now, one of those countermeasures is containment. I'm going to break these two into two different sections because this is really important. Now, one of the first things you want to do when an incident takes place is lower the impact. You want to lower the damage that has happened. So when you lower that damage, well, then you're stopping the spread of the attack and you're not letting it creep into any other elements of your network or of your system. Now, there are two different ways that you can do containment. One of them is short-term containment. So that means you just put a stop to it, you unplug it or whatever, or the long-term containment, where you set up a clean system or you pivot it into a honeypot, which we had talked about before. These are all examples of containment. So you're stopping the spread of the actual threat itself. If it's a malware, right, and the malware is trying to replicate itself in that system and another system, well, if you remember, one of the most things you have to do, things you want to do, one of the best practices in cybersecurity is segmenting your network into different departments. If you have micro segmentation, where each bunch of computers is on their own segment, you can block off or cut off that entire segment from the rest of the network, and that's a way of containing it. Containment is one of the most important things because there have been times where I've seen we thought we contained the threat, but that threat was able to still get out and we had to contain an even bigger area. So what sometimes some professionals will do is they'll do a containment on the actual impacted asset, whether that's an end user or whether that's a server of some sort. And then they'll do another layer of containment on the outside of that segment, meaning they will contain that entire network and department and only allow certain things to go through. And then sometimes they'll also do a third one, where they'll do a full containment of that entire department. So think of it this way. They contain one computer, and then they contain that entire block or that section, and then they contain the entire department. So there are three containment layers, so that in case anything were to get out, it doesn't get out as far. Containment is one of the most important steps because after containment, you go through the process of eradication. When you contain a threat, well, then you then put it in like its own little cage, and that's when you can fully remove the threat. So removing the threat entirely can come up in different ways. So you can use antivirus to get rid of it. You can completely shut down that server and get rid of it, and then move everything to your backup server. It can be resetting certain credentials, and it can be closing the original vulnerability. All of these are different ways that you eradicate the threat. The eradication of the threat means that without a shadow of a doubt, that threat no longer lives on your network. The best way to do that is to bring up a backup from that server or from that workstation, because when you have that backup, well, then you know that that's a clean and verified backup and there is no more threat in there. So when you put that up, that means that you eradicated the threat. This is one of the reasons why backups are so important in cybersecurity, because then we know that we are working with a clean and good computer. Now, that's why recovery is so important. When we have done the eradication step, well, then we go into recovery, which means that all the systems are running back as normal. If it's an end user computer or a laptop that got impacted, well, then you restore that computer back to its normal baseline. So that means that business operations haven't been stopped. Everything is going back to normal. Now, one of the first things that incident response people do is when they bring things back to normal and when things are back into recovery, they're still not done. They're not resting yet. The first thing they do is they monitor that end system for reinfection. They monitor it for follow-up attacks, because threat actors often do not just attack once. They'll attack multiple times the same system or adjacent systems. So there's a very heavy monitoring process that happens after recovery to make sure that the security team didn't miss anything. Essentially, recovery is just making sure that you're bringing the systems back online as usual. Now, you have to do so carefully, because if for some reason a threat actor bypasses that, well, then you're in trouble. Now, like I said before, one of the most important things you can do in cybersecurity is do post-incident analysis, also known as lessons learned. You'll hear people call this lessons learned, a retro, post-mortem, post-incident analysis. All of them have a theme that we are going to talk about what happened. That's the entire goal. So you're doing a review of how you responded to the incident. Typically, this review is either a meeting or a phone call. I've run several of these in my time, and I always find it very interesting how people, when they come to these, they want to protect themselves. Now, I've been at some companies where they said, okay, I messed up here, or I could have done this better, and they're very upfront with it. But if you're ever in this scenario in a post-mortem, the best thing you can do is come fully prepared with understanding what went wrong, what worked, and how it could have been improved. It is so much better if you yourself say, I could have done this quicker, I could have identified this faster, we could have done XYZ. When you put yourself up front there, well, then that gives people permission to do the same. For example, there was one incident where it was a phishing email, and the phishing email had malware on it. Now, the person who clicked it has a history of declining to do the security awareness trainings because they were director, and they had failed multiple of our security awareness training and phishing simulations. Now, we kept trying, by we, I mean me, I kept pushing to say, hey, we need to have him do specialized training. We need to have him like sit in on a one-on-one training with me, but we can't, this is considered a security risk. And I remember I spoke to the CISO and he said, well, he's the director of sales, so we can't really waste his time doing that. He needs to sell. And then when he clicked that phishing email, that brought in malware into the sales department. Now, when all of this happened, we luckily had an incident response plan. We had some technology built in to stop the malware from spreading. It only went to his computer and to his assistants, but we were able to contain it, and we were able to bring up a backup of his computer. Now, when it came to the incident response or to the lessons learned, it was what we call a coming to terms conversation, I guess you could say, right? Where I needed to use my interpersonal communication skills to say, hey, this is a postmortem where we're learning what happened and how we can improve. And this is not a blaming situation. This is not a place to point fingers. And so what I did is I said, so what happened was a phishing email. I think that what we could have done is we could have made our phishing simulations similar to what we'd seen. I think our phishing campaigns could have been more interesting. I think we could have gamified it so that it becomes more of a competition between departments, so it incentivizes people. And what I was doing there was I was showing where I could have improved. When you show your vulnerability and what you could have done better, that gives people the permission to do the same. It went swimmingly. And this sales director and I, we're still professional colleagues today, where he'll send people my way if they need security awareness training. And in turn, he and I have a great relationship, because after that, he said, I totally didn't realize how I was a potential huge risk to the entire organization. I can't sell if our product is hacked. And so I need to do security awareness training. That is completely my bad. Andre, I appreciate what you said, but I take full ownership of it. So it was very transformative. And it is exactly the point of a lessons learned, a post-incident analysis. It is to understand what went wrong, what worked, and most importantly, how can we improve from it? What can we do better? So this, I consider one of my biggest wins of my career, because then we were able to update our policies, update our tools, and update our trainings and simulations to make it more interesting for people to learn. So a report is part of post-incident analysis in this life cycle. Yes, that is correct. So the post-incident analysis, this is like the lessons learned portion, but you are correct that we do go into reporting. Now, the reporting piece we'll talk about a little more down the line, but if I were you, I would remember that there are 5 key stages in the incident response lifecycle. You do need to memorize it. So it's preparation, detection, containment and eradication, recovery, and post-incident. So these are the 5 steps. Sometimes people call it 6 because they'll split containment and eradication. Now, each step is really important, and they have to be followed in order. You can't skip preparation and go straight into recovery. You need to take each and every step, not just this, but as I mentioned before, you need to document that entire process. All right. Now, you might be asking, okay, this is great. Well, then how do we actually investigate all this? How do we find out this information? Well, the best way to do that is through digital forensics. Now, digital forensics, like I mentioned last class, is essentially an investigative tool to collect and analyze data so that it can be used in court, which means it needs to be legally sound. Legally sound just means that it can be used in court, and there's without a shadow of a doubt that it is truthful and it is trustworthy. That's the important part of digital forensics. Now, I would call digital forensics the science, because it is a science, the science of preserving, collecting, analyzing, and presenting digital information. If you think about digital forensics, it is essentially used to find out, identify what exactly happened, and then determining how it happened, followed by who was responsible. All of these are going to answer the question of what happened. That's what it's trying to do. It's going to answer the question of what happened. Now, digital forensics is really important because there are times where this is used in courts. That means that courts are actually saying, hey, we need to understand what exactly happened and we need someone to explain it. But you, as a digital forensics expert, say, hey, I'm the cybersecurity digital forensics. I can answer all the questions you have because I did the forensic work on it and it's all documented right here. So you might be asking yourself, well, when exactly is it used? When exactly is it used? It's essentially used after an incident takes place, so you can track back, look back on exactly what the attacker did. More often, sometimes you'll see that the forensic report, it has a section that says attacker action history. So it says attacker entered the network on this date at this time. Attacker tried to get into this, and it'll have timestamps to show it there. So we have like a flow that we can follow. Now, the digital forensics is also used if we see that there is suspicious behavior. A very common example is an insider threat. As a reminder, an insider threat is when an employee is misusing a computer, misusing data. They're trying to access some data that they shouldn't, or maybe they're trying to access data at like 3 a.m. from like another website or another location. Those are all examples. So, and then the last one is digital forensics could also be used in legal investigations or compliance reviews. All right. Okay. So what is the importance of digital forensics? Well, for one, digital forensics is used to preserve the evidence. That means that we are wanting to know who touched the original data and who didn't touch it, and then we want to know the procedures associated with it. We're going to talk about chain of custody later on, and let's see, anything else? Okay, I think we're good there. So if you're wondering about what digital forensics is, I would say digital forensics is the process of understanding what happened during an incident and answers the who, what, when, where, why, the 5 W's, as I think someone mentioned it in last class. And then they also talked about wanting to know what data was collected, what is the evidence, and who changed it, if anyone. Obviously, no one should have changed it, but the idea is it needs to be as trustworthy as possible. Now, everything when it comes to digital forensics, they have to be traceable. The best way to make it traceable is to make it documented, meaning you're writing everything down. So those are the things I want you to really remember when it comes to digital forensics. So how exactly do we acquire it? So forensic acquisition is just the process of collecting the data. It's the process of collecting the digital evidence that makes sure that it hasn't been changed, it hasn't been damaged, so that it's as trustworthy as possible. I like to think of forensic acquisition is like collecting your fingerprints at a crime scene. So if you're at a crime scene, like a real crime scene, the first thing you'll do is, oh, we want to find out who did it. So you want to use like one of those things where you can collect the fingerprint using like a dust, and then you run it, and then you use that as evidence. Now, if you collect that information wrong, let's say if you're trying to do it and then you smudge it for some reason, well, then that can ruin the entire investigation, because that means that evidence was collected improperly. So what you want to do to make sure that you're not collecting data improperly is to use what we call forensically sound tools. What this means is you want to use specialized tools designed to collect the data without changing it. That means more often than not, you collect it by saying, hey, I want you to give me this data, and then I don't want you, the system, the tool, to not let me make any changes to it. So these tools are made specifically to preserve the original evidence and make sure that nothing gets altered. So here are some examples of digital forensic tools. So autopsy is one that I've seen before. Wireshark is also another one. You all might have seen this before. That's typically associated with network analysis. And then I've also seen volatility. Those are the three that I've seen. But these are some examples of the forensic tools. If you're ever interested in them, I think that I think that the government site has some examples. Yeah. So here are, if you're ever interested in what kind of digital forensic tools exist out there, you can check out this document for those of you who like working in tech. But there are a bunch of different tools that exist that allow you to collect data without fear of you changing it. Then there's creating what we call forensic images. A forensic image is essentially an exact copy of a digital storage device. This is specifically for a SSD, which is solid state drive, aka like an external hard drive of some sort, or like a memory card. It can even be like a memory card within a camera or a memory card within your phone. All of these are storage devices that you can create a forensic image of. Forensic image is a fancy way of saying you're just making an exact copy, okay? Now, when I talked about not allowing you to make modifications, that is in relation to permissions. If you remember, there's a permission of read and write and view, read, and write. The writing part means that you can make modifications. There's something that is called a write blocker. A write blocker, it's either hardware or software, is a solution to prevent the original device from being changed during the imaging process. So it physically stops you from writing, stop any writing from happening during the evidence collection process. So the use of forensic images is really important because it ensures the trustworthiness and the intactness of the actual device that you're collecting it from. Does creating forensic image take a lot of time? Umair, that's a great question. It depends on how big that storage device is, because sometimes those forensic images can be massive. You might be it's kind of like if you're trying to copy one file from one place to another. That's all it is you're making a copy of it. So however long it takes you to move your entire music library, which would be like 10 gigs, to another folder, that's how long it would take. So it depends. Emmanuel, I'm just going to go ahead and answer your question that yes, reporting is part of post-incident analysis in the lifecycle. Then there's a process of chain of custody documentation. Now, the chain of custody is just knowing who handled what data when. That's all it's answering. It's keeping a record of who had that evidence. So that chain of custody essentially makes sure that we know that. Can you please mention a couple of software that can help with digital forensics? Oh, that's a great question, Luis. You can check out that list that I gave you there. They give you a bunch of different tools that you can use for digital forensics. Great question, Luis. Okay. And then, so the concept of the chain of custody here is so that everyone knows that whenever whenever evidence or data is handed over from one person to another, it must be documented so there's no doubt about where the evidence has been or who handled it. Typically, it's kind of like receiving a package. When you receive a package, you sign for it saying, hey, I have received a package. Okay. Are there any firms that strictly deal with forensic analysis, much like auditors? Yes, there actually are. So in my case, I would say that the people that I've worked with, a bunch of them have done not just forensic, but they do a bunch of different things. So it varies. However, I think that one of the companies that comes to mind, I think it's BRG. I think it's BRG. What is that? Yes, Berkeley something. BRG forensics, digital forensics. Ah, all right. I think this is it. Okay, yeah. So this is forensic accounting and investigations. I think this is one of those. They're mainly working with financial scandals. It does involve a level of IT. So BRG is an example of one. Yeah, that's one of the first ones that comes to mind. But you can look it up. There are a bunch of different ones. Okay. Then there's documenting the acquisition process. Oh, we got more questions. Is there a graphical user interface application for forensic analysis? Corbetta, that's a great question. So Corbetta is asking, is there a UI, so something that you can click, just like these are things that we can click for forensic analysis? It depends on what tool you use. Some of the tools have them, other tools don't. More often than not, if you have like a software or hardware, it will have a UI. Great question, Corbetta. Then there's the documentation of the acquisition process. This just means writing down everything about how the evidence was collected. So that means, hey, what tool did we use to collect the evidence? When and where was the acquisition happened? Who did the acquisition? Were there any unusual observations about the acquisition? You do have to note, hey, there was a fire. The computer that we're trying to collect forensic data from was burned. So we need to note that, hey, this was burned. So the entire process with documenting it is it helps prove the process was done correctly. This is considered following processes and procedures for transparency and trustworthiness. Keep in mind, you have to keep all of this by the book because there's a chance that you might be presenting this in court. And then there's a concept of verifying evidence. So the verifying evidence is just talking about verifying that the copy is identical. Then there's documenting metadata and context. This, when you're thinking of metadata, it's essentially like additional information about that data, such as when was the file created, what were the file permissions. For example, let's look at example picture metadata. So when I look at example picture metadata, it is something like this. So see here, I'll zoom in so everyone can see. I used to work as a photographer, and this is incredibly blurry. I am so sorry. But essentially, if you look down here, it's showing you a picture and it said, hey, this was created on this day. It was modified by this. But if you're looking at additional data, well, then you can also know where exactly this picture was taken. It'll give you like the GPS coordinates and whatnot. The other piece is maintaining secure storage. So maintaining secure storage just means that you're storing all of the evidence in a place that is safe and controlled, meaning there's probably a lock and key associated with it. If you've ever seen a crime show, they typically show you that, hey, we store all the evidence in this very secure place where you need lock and key, you need permission, you need to sign in if you're looking into it. And then if you're storing digital data, especially, obviously you need to use encryption and that you're using correct access control so that only you or the people that are allowed to access it are able to access it. This is in order to prevent tampering, prevent theft, and prevent accidental loss. And the last one is following legal and regulatory requirements. This means that you're following all the right steps to the law when it comes to forensic acquisition. This means that you're following all the right privacy rules. You're making sure that you're following the right chain of custody standards. There are auditors that audit for that, followed by making sure that you're following court evidence rules. So this means being by the book. Anytime you hear someone say we've done it by the book, they means that they've done all the necessary correct steps to ensure that the evidence has been handled, collected, and has been documented correctly so that it can hold up in court. Keep in mind, if you collect evidence incorrectly, for example, if I collect evidence by sneaking into an office and stealing it with a USB, well, that will not be admissible in court because I did not follow the right procedures to collect that evidence. So that is called having a case thrown out based off a technicality. It happens. So we need to make sure as cybersecurity professionals that we're collecting it properly. So in summary, forensic acquisition is not just the collection of evidence, but collecting it as securely as possible and not changing it. That means making sure we have write blockers, meaning that once we collect it, we aren't able to change anything or write anything. That means documenting it, making sure we know who the chain of custody is, making sure we're verifying the integrity of the data, and then making sure that we're storing the data as best as possible. So why do we talk about legal and why do we talk about any regulatory requirements? Well, one of the main reasons is because we need to be able to say without a shadow of a doubt who did what. That's what we need to know. So when it comes to this, there are two terms we should know. First is legal hold and chain of custody. It's essentially making sure that we're preserving and making sure that the evidence that we've collected is as trustworthy as possible. Legal hold is simply the process to tell people it is a process used to tell people not to delete or change any information that might be needed for a legal case. What does that mean? So when it comes to legal hold, that means, hey, we need that computer for evidence. We need that computer for investigation. That means please don't delete any emails, don't delete any files, don't alter any logs, and don't make any other changes to digital records. There are some times where when you're working on an incident, there might be for an insider threat where you have a user who's stealing data and trying to sell it to the competitors, but they'll delete that data off their computer to try and make it look like they never did anything. This actually happened. I think, let me refresh here. So when it says legal hold, that means please don't change anything on your computer. It makes sure that the important data isn't lost before it can be reviewed or consulted on. Okay? That's all legal hold means. AKA, if something is in legal hold, you're taking a big sticker and saying, do not touch it. Now, I think I explained chain of custody already, but in summary, it just tracks how evidence is handled from the moment it's found. Meaning, hey, did you handle the evidence? Did you handle the evidence? Oh yeah, I did. Here's my name and here's the date when I handled it and here's my signature. So it'll typically be like a document that has date, person's name, signature, and time of use, maybe even reason for use, right? And then that is what is being presented to the court when it comes to chain of custody as well as the report. It answers Who collected the evidence? Who touched the evidence? When and where was that evidence collected? So why does all this matter? Why does chain of custody and legal hold matter? When we're talking about that, we're essentially mainly focused on knowing that the evidence has been collected properly and that the court is not going to question or invalidate the entire investigation because we did everything by the book. So that's what legal hold and chain of custody means. Brian says GPS coordinates on every picture, kind of spooky. Can this be protected? Yeah, you can disable some of these functions. The only reason why I know about the GPS coordinates is because I used to be a wedding photographer, a second shooter. And so when the primary photographer was editing it, I couldn't help but notice that she was looking at the metadata, and that metadata had GPS coordinates of where that picture was taken. Now you can disable that on some of the cameras, or you can strip that information, but yeah, pretty cool. All right, let's kind of shift our focus a little bit and go into e-discovery. Okay, so what exactly is e-discovery? Well, in short, e-discovery is the process of collecting, processing, and analyzing electronic data, specifically electronic data as evidence in legal cases. You'll see here that we're talking a lot about legal because it's the entire process. It's the concept that we're going to be cybersecurity professionals working with crime. A hack is a crime. Therefore, we have to be able to speak to that crime. Speaking to that crime means we need to do electronic discovery of anything that would be useful to that. Think of it as essentially gathering all the different digital clues that could help prove that what happened happened. It's like collecting all of that evidence. Now, as you can imagine, in today's day and age, everyone has an email, everyone has a phone, everyone's doing text messages, everyone has social media, everyone has a lot of what we call digital footprint. So that digital footprint is what e-discovery, electronic discovery, is trying to collect. It's collecting this evidence, these emails, these documents, these Facebook posts, these Instagram posts. All of these are used to be as like potential legal evidence. So what's the step-by-step process on the e-discovery? Well, the first, it's identification. Well, we need to figure out what digital data might be relevant to the case. So that might be talking about, okay, it was a phishing email. Well, then we need to understand what emails there were. Was it a certain document that someone tried to steal? Was it a potential database? Was it social media content? If it was in marketing, was it a marketing IP, so intellectual property for the organization that someone was trying to sell to a competitor? All of these are real and true examples that I've seen, and these are things that we've used as actual evidence. So if an employee, let's say, is suspected of leaking information, we would want access to the emails, their files. We want access to chat history and their browsing history in case they tried to access or send information via the company email, right? These are all examples of some of the digital recovery that we want to do. We have a question from Quabena. How long does a company need to store or hold a forensic data before discarding it if there is no legal action? How does a company take legal action if the threat actor is anonymous? That is a great question, Quabena. Quabena. So, how best to answer it? So, in cybersecurity, you are not meant, or it is best practice not to hold on to data for longer than you have to. A lot of legal places, they have a certain time frame that they can hang on to it for. So it depends. Sometimes it's 3 years, sometimes it's 5 years, sometimes it's longer. It all depends on the severity of the case. So that's, I think, the easiest way to answer that question. How does a company take legal action if the threat actor is anonymous? So that becomes a little tricky because when it comes to hackers, right, there is typically a digital footprint, meaning that there are, if you're walking in the snow, you're leaving footprints behind you. We can trace that back to certain people. Now, sometimes they can hide behind proxies, they can hide behind a bunch of different firewalls or sorry, VPNs, and maybe they're even using a remote desktop for some reason, right? Those are all different ways that you can hide your identity. But if you have enough money, if you have enough technology, well, then you can find the threat actor. So it all just depends on the complexity and whatever resources you have available to you. Great question. So there's also preservation. So preservation of digital preservation is essentially once relevant data is found, you need to make sure that you lock it and you keep it from being deleted, tampered with, or accidentally changed. Again, this is a concept of making sure it keeps its integrity. Then there's collection. After you preserve that, then the data is now gathered using forensic tools. This may involve like copying the data from phones or different computers. It's using like software to keep the data unchanged during transfer. It essentially ensures that it's indefensible to say there has been no changes and documenting it accordingly. Then there is processing the data. That means raw data is cleaned up, it's organized. It's when I say raw data, you're not deleting it, you're essentially reorganizing it or putting it in a format that is understandable. And then you can convert different file types to make it consistent. So changing all Word documents to PDFs so that there's no changes in it. And then you can remove duplicates. You obviously have to document that. And then you can extract some of the metadata such as timestamps and whatnot to make sure that you understand what happened when. After that, you review it to make sure that you went through all the right procedures. Typically, the legal team will also go through a review process. What will happen here is you typically put all of the evidence into one file location, and then you can go through a tool that searches all of those for specific keywords, file types, and then you can tag that information accordingly. Let's say this is evidence that is associated with a phishing email on this date, so we put phishing tag there. This is based on the data leaks, we put data leak there, so on and so forth. Is collection not supposed to come before preservation? So I see why you would think that, but the preservation here is we identify it, we preserve it, meaning, okay, we've identified it, let's put a cage around it, make sure no one can touch it. And then you pick it up. It's like if you have a crab, right? And it's in the sand, well, then you kind of like, you identify the crab, you preserve it by putting a block around it so it doesn't go anywhere, no one can do anything, and then you pick it up. That pickup process would be the collection. Can a document be retrieved in case someone unintentionally deleted it? Yes. More often than not, a lot of computers have backups on backups, especially if you have incremental backups. So it's never truly completely deleted. How does the increasing use of cloud services impact digital forensics for organizations? Very great question, Martin. It makes it a lot easier because if something is in the cloud, that means that there's always a backup of some sort, some way, shape, or form. So it makes it a lot easier for digital forensics to go through and collect that evidence. Very good question. Now, with the emergence of AI, it also is really, really powerful because AI, if you're asking a question that's based on data, all AI is doing is looking at a bunch of data. So instead of looking at a bunch of data, it's referencing, quote unquote, a bunch of evidence. So it's become more and more a lot easier in order to do that. So then the analysis, it just means that we are digging into the actual evidence itself. We're trying to understand patterns of behavior. We're trying to understand the timelines, any correlations between the different data sources, meaning Were there any keywords that they were looking for? What was the hacker actually after? It's kind of painting a visual big picture of what exactly happened. Speaking of visuals, the final step here is presentation. This means that we're presenting the actual evidence in court. This is the process of someone saying, showcasing evidence A, B, what have you. The presentation comes in the form of screenshots, or it can come in the form of an expert witness testimony. That could be you, where they say, hey, what did you find in the evidence? And you say, I found this. And it could be showing chats or different reports, as it was said. So when it comes to the presentation piece, communication between the tech team and the lawyers is really, really important. So if I were to summarize all of this, I would say that e-discovery is the process of to find, collect, and prepare the digital data or information specifically for legal use. So this is where you go through the phases of identify, preserve, collect, process, review, analyze, and then present it. The entire concept here is centered around the I in the CIA triad: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Integrity, making sure there's been no changes. Okay, so someone had asked about writing reports. We'll get to that right after we take a quick break. So this is the duck timer thread. Everyone, please put your numbers in, and we will give you about 15 minutes. All right. Let's go ahead and get back on it. Okay. So someone earlier had asked about writing reports and if that falls into the post-incident activity. Well, that is correct. So writing reports is about like one of the most important things with an incident. Yes, we are recording. One of the most important things about the incident, because it essentially tells us what happened to how it was handled and then how we can actually improve. Now, instead of actually like running through this entire thing, I just want to show you it. In essence, think of an incident report as essentially giving you all the basic information about the incident. So it's talking about specifically, one of the most important things is the date and time of the incident. We need to know when exactly it happened so that we can backtrack and work backwards from it. Maybe it happened a year or maybe a month after we implemented a new software from a third party. We also need to know who discovered or who reported it. And then we need to have descriptions of what exactly occurred. So the incident report is typically broken down into different formats. Sheldon asks, is there a general template to follow when writing a report? Yes, there is. So one of the first things you'll have an executive summary. So an example is this document here. So this is a sample template from Palo Alto. I'll give you two. There's another one here. I think this one is Canadian, but these are two examples. But typically, no one really cares what format it comes in as long as it contains the information they're looking for, which typically comes down to this, okay? So it has an executive summary as well as different things associated with the actual report. This one is meant for employees. This is an actual report. It's a template that shows you, okay, who did it, when was it last made. Something else that I don't think this one, it could be at the bottom. Yep, that's it. It's version control. So the version control says the date, what was the person who made the change, what version it is, 1.1, 1.2, 2.2, 3.2. All these are examples, followed by what exactly was the change that was done. So it has the incident summary, the actual information that was exposed. It has the date and time. It has the analysis. These are all elements of the incident response report that is most important to the people reading it. You might be asking, okay, who's the audience of it? Who will be reading it? It'll be lawyers. It'll be C-suite executives. It could be like law enforcement. It could be regulators. It could be auditors. These are all people with a high level of detail that need to know exactly what happened. That's why this is so important. Okay? Let's see. So I think this, I'll leave you all to be able to review this. The reports themselves are pretty straightforward. The key element to understand when it comes to incident response, or sorry, when it comes to incident reports, is that you need to document every single stage of the security incident, and then you need to make it as very detailed and well-written report that supports and that's able to kind of be used as evidence for how to prevent this in the future, as well as be accountable. Typically, there will be a section here where it says lessons learned, and you'll say, these are the things we could have done better. And then you can have an action items section that says, these are the steps we're taking to improve it. These are the dates. And then you do a follow-up appendices that shows this is when we completed all those action items. Now, does this happen every time? Do people actually follow through on those? Sometimes, okay? I wouldn't say that it is a given that they would, but ideally you would. All right, so now let's talk a little bit about how data can help incident investigations. So essentially, if you put yourself in the shoes of a detective doing a crime scene, one of the things you're going to look for is evidence. The same thing happens with cybersecurity. Data equals evidence. It is extremely important and essential to understand what the evidence is inside of an incident so that you can answer the key questions. Things such as what happened, who was involved, what exactly occurred, where did it occur, when did it occur, how did it happen? The data is what tells us the story of what happened during the incident. So what are the things you have to do in order to get to that point? Well, there's understanding it, asking the who, what, when, where, why. Then you need to identify the scope and the impact. This is important because then you can understand which specific tool was hit. Was it our network? Was it a system? Was it our operations? What exactly was hit? And then you need to understand what kind of damage was done. So an example for the understanding the scope here is if a compromised account has access to multiple servers, well, then the data reveals when that happened and how that happened, as well as which servers. So the data is telling us the what, which is really, really important. Not only is that important, but the data helps us understand who exactly is the threat actor. So if you look at the logs, if you look at the IP, if you look at any of the digital signatures, well, then it all points a picture to one specific attacker or one specific IP address. So what this does is it helps attributing or understanding what the attacker was looking for, what they were after, and it could potentially have their motives involved. So this is where we take their TTPs into account. So that's tactics, techniques, and procedures. The idea here with threat actors is they each have their own motive. One threat actor could be after money. Another threat actor could be after making a statement on the website. They all have different ideals. So when we use the data and we follow the tracks, it leads us to the actual person in question. That is also something that helps with the timeline. With the data, with the event logs, like I mentioned before, there's somewhere in the logs that says date and time. That date and timestamp in the event logs is going to be able to paint a picture of the sequence of events. It shows us, hey, these are the things that happened. And so this helps investigators understand more of the incident, especially from a timeline perspective. Then there's also learning from the incident. That means that when you do a post-incident data analysis, when you do a deep dive into it, you'll better be able to understand what went wrong. Do we have any controls or any security measures in place that didn't work? And then how can we prevent this next time? The data paints that picture for us. It really, really helps us understand it. So When it comes to data, I would say that it helps. I would say that data is collected from multiple resources. So it can be taken from logs, network traffic. It could also be some file metadata, like we had talked about before. The data is what is being fed to the forensic analysts. So they're the ones who do the disk images. They're the ones who do full snapshots, memory dumps. They're the ones who do the raw network capturing. So if you're using Wireshark, well, then you can collect all of the traffic on that network, or you can review logs of that network so that you can find any malware traces or find any user activity. Data is used in threat intelligence by finding out any specific threat trends or any specific security advisories. If the CISA is telling us, hey, a new CVE came out on Windows and you have that Windows, well, then that's a security advisor you can take in mind. Then there's malware databases. So a lot of threat intelligence researchers, they essentially look for all these little threads that can give us a head start. They provide context. They provide context also as like known attacker methods or indicators of compromise, and it helps the teams compare the incidences that is happening to them to known attacks, known instances. Maybe there's a pattern that they're seeing that they can use to respond to it a lot better. Now, then there's the concept of data correlation. That means that we're using a bunch of our different systems on our network to understand the threat, to understand the incident. So that means we're looking at our firewalls, all the IPs, addresses that are coming in and out. We're looking at our intrusion prevention and our intrusion detection tools. We're looking at our scenes, we're looking at our endpoints, we're looking at every single piece of data so that we can understand any patterns or any outliers, any anomalies that might indicate to us, hey, they're correlated. They're all going towards this specific network or this specific server. Then we can better understand the threat overall. Now, something I want to talk about here with data correlation and analysis. This is a place where AI tends to shine because AI lives off of data. The more data AI has, the better they can create correlations and connections and patterns associated with that data. So it's important for us to understand that this is one of the ways AI can help. It can help us find those patterns. It can help us find those anomalies that we're looking for. Then there's the concept of continuous monitoring. Now, if you remember, continuous monitoring is the concept of having an understanding of the status of all of your servers, having live alerts, having an understanding of a live understanding of your behaviors or your patterns that already exist on your network. This is why a SIEM is one of the most important things in cybersecurity. As a reminder, a SIEM is a security information and event management solution. It can be a software or it can be a hardware. What this does is it collects all of that data, all of that information, and then it analyzes it to give us a quick and easy view into what exactly was detected, what exactly is an anomaly. It gives us kind of like a score of, hey, someone should look into this. It gives us alerts. So continuous monitoring is an important tool in cybersecurity. Now, I would say that if you're going to remember anything from here, know that data is king. Data is fundamental in incident response because it helps inform the incident investigation. It helps us understand what happens. It helps us learn from the incident overall. It helps us be able to detect any patterns that happened or any abnormalities so that we're not operating in the blind. When we have more data to work with, well, then we paint a bigger picture of when the incident is, which overall helps us contain and eradicate the incident, as well as learn how to prevent it in the future. So I talked about all the sources where we can get data from. Well, a lot of these sources come from a lot of different places, but some of the most important ones are listed here. The first one where you can collect data from is data logs. Now, a data log I like to think of it as like a diary. A computer has a diary of every single thing that happened that day. Who clicked what? Who went to what website? Who logged into this document? Who changed this specific document? Are there any errors that we had on this specific server? These are all log data that can be used to understand the incident. So what we can do with these logs, and we can trace anything that a threat actor did. If they tried to log into a certain place, but it failed. If they tried to change the configuration settings of a router. If they're trying to install a malware. All of these are different things that we can track using logs. Now, what's beneficial for that is with these logs, they can actually be used from law enforcement. They can use for auditing purposes. These logs are essentially a great way to understand what happened overall. Now, the benefit is that with a SIEM, it's all centralized in one specific place. So with all of that in one specific place, it's easy to review. Then you have network traffic data. So network traffic data, in very simple terms, is understanding who did what on the network. It's as if we turned our network into like a physical building, and everyone who's going to a website is going from one room to another. Well, then network traffic data is just the surveillance cameras that watch us go from one place to another. Is there a way to prevent an incident which is similar to an already tracked incident? Oh, yeah. Okay, great. Glad it was answered. Awesome. So with network data, it shows us it shows us communication patterns. It's showing us who's talking to who, when, and how. Am I sending an email to Sheldon, and then how is Sheldon responding? That tells us who, Sheldon and I, when, today, how, email. So that is essentially network traffic data. Now, network traffic data is important because it allows us to see any access attempts. If someone tries to access something they shouldn't, it let us know if malware is trying to communicate outside of our servers. And it is essentially anything with network traffic data is anything associated with things such as like IP address, maybe ports, maybe certain protocols that are being used, such as TCP, UDP. All of these are in essence traffic data. Now, when you're trying to understand traffic data, the things that you'll typically use are packet sniffers or network sniffers. This is like Wireshark, where you capture all the network all the information that's going on in your network, as well as firewalls, because they're looking at access and intrusion detection or intrusion prevention systems. These are all things that track the network traffic and network data. Then there's endpoint data. Again, fancy way of saying what's happening on your computer, what's happening on your work laptop, or what's actually happening on your workstation. So they're saying, hey, did this workstation open this file? Did this workstation use this program? This workstation try to access this file at like 3 o'clock in the morning, but it says their location is in Antarctica. All of these are examples of endpoint data usage. So this helps us be able to catch threats directly that are happening on that specific device. If you remember, we talked about EDR last class, endpoint detection and response. So the endpoint detection and response tool monitors all the actions on that computer, and then they send that data to a log at a log location. So in this case, let's see. I would explain this as like if malware were on a laptop, the EDR system will be able to find that and then shut that down. Other pieces of data are system logs. This is just saying, hey, what's happening on a specific server? What exactly do you need to know about that? Well, this is important because whether it's Windows, Linux, or what have you, it's easiest for us to know if there are any server errors or if there are any malwares or misconfigurations that happen. If there are any of those misconfigurations or any of those issues, well, then typically there will be a notification element there. That notification element means that there's going to be a real-time alert that is triggered, typically through an automation of some sort. So that could be the SIEM or the antivirus, that kind of stuff. And then we'll talk about prioritization later, but that's what the security alerts and notifications would do. Can two analysts work on an incident simultaneously? Yes. So a lot of the time, a lot of analysts will typically work on one incident by covering different tracks. So one analyst will look at network traffic. One analyst will look at the endpoint detection and response. Another analyst could look at threat intelligence feeds, seeing if they're seeing anything about our company or our system on the dark web, seeing if there's anything that has been mentioned in like hacker forums, or seeing if anything was mostly mentioned in OSINT. OSINT stands for Open Source Intelligence. It means if you look up your name on Google and you find your name on multiple websites, that means that it's on the OSINT dashboard, meaning it's everything that is publicly available. What would a VPN be read as when looking into digital footprint? What would you see? So, Brendan, that's a great question. If you're looking at digital footprint, they typically come up as IP addresses. So anytime a computer has any interaction with another computer or a website, its identification is typically its IP address. The reason for that is because we have this functionality in networking, not to get too technical, but all of the computers have an IP address, which can be translated as their name. So their name would be how you would identify them. If someone was using a VPN, that VPN would mask that person's name and give them a pseudonym. So that IP would look like a real IP, but it's a fake, okay? And so at times there is a repository of all valid IP addresses and then all VPN IP addresses. So that's what you typically see. And then there's what we call a UEBA, User and Entity Behavior Analytics. In very simple terms, all this is a very intense, it's a very intense like Big Brother watcher. It's a tool who watches how users behave, and it is able to predict that user cool in the future. It's very cool tech stuff. So not only that, but it can flag any actions that fall out of character. A very simple example is if you go into the office every day at 8:30 and then you open your email at 8:35. Well, then the UABA is going to basically like find out or pick up on the fact that that's what you do every day when you come into work. It builds out that pattern. This is one of the tools that was already quote unquote AI related before AI was a huge thing. And so it was able to kind of like predict if something were to happen down the line, or it's able to track if you're trying to log into things out of sync. So like I mentioned, a bunch of different data sources that you can look into and a bunch of different tools in which you can pick that data from. So we talked about logs. I know I mentioned logs a lot, but in essence, logs are just a diary of what that specific system did. Or in the case of incident response, it's a digital breadcrumb of that tells us what happened where. If you remember, a diary notes everything that you did that day. So the system notes everything that you did that day. So for an incident responder, they want to have access to the logs. That's why the first thing they say is, hey, did you check the logs? Because then they can see the source of truth of what exactly happened. And then that helps them with the remediation process, with the investigation overall. So there are a bunch of different type of logs that you can get into. So one of the first one is authentication logs. In essence, this is just looking at login attempts, password changes, account lockouts. These are all associated with someone trying to access something that they shouldn't, whether it was successful or whether it failed. Why this is important is because it helps us identify unauthorized attempts And then it also helps us know if any of the credentials were stolen. A very simple example is if someone tries to log in to a website about 50 to 100 times in 3 seconds. We already know that humans can't do that. That's not possible at all. Then we know that if they did attempt that 50 times and then they succeeded, all of a sudden, a new username and password was created at an admin level. We know that that's also suspicious. That would be found in the authentication logs. Then there are firewall logs. These firewall logs are essentially like network traffic that we're monitoring at a specific entrance point. Now, if you remember, there's a network diagram and you have a bunch of different firewalls in a bunch of different places. So those firewalls track everyone who goes in and out of that network. So then we're able to know exactly the source and destination IP of that IP address. Not only that, but a lot of the firewalls nowadays are really powerful because they tend to know what specific ports and protocols they were using, and then we're able to allow or disallow that. The good thing about firewalls is that because we're able to detect this, we can then detect if someone is trying to exfiltrate data. We can detect if someone is trying to do a denial of service attack based on the IP, or if someone is trying to access a specific asset that they're not supposed to have access to. What this looks like in real time, if you're the threat actor and you're trying to access a specific website that is internal only, is that the website just won't load. That's the simple way that it looks like on the attacker's end. So that's what a firewall logs would have. It would have the IP address trying to access a specific place, followed with date and time. Then you have the IPS and IDS systems. Now, this is an intrusion detection, intrusion prevention system. This is essentially alerts that are generated by specifically suspicious activity. That's all it is. So it lets us know if they can see or if they've stopped any intrusions, any malware attempts, that kind of stuff. Application and DNS logs. Applications are all of the tools that you use inside of your organization. It could be email and it could be whatnot, but these show us all of the different activities that happened on that specific application. This is important in case one of those applications were associated with the hack, let's say like a database. So if you had a database application, well, then you can see exactly any errors or any interactions that happen with the database. Same thing with DNS logs. A DNS log, DNS stands for Domain Name System, and it operates in the sense that you have a website like facebook.com, but in the computer world, it's not facebook.com. It's 10.2.1. What have you. It's an IP address. So the domain name system changes that IP address into human readable like facebook.com. So it lets us know what websites that person was trying to query, what websites that person was trying to get to. And then they can also kind of like revert it and find out the IP address that they were trying to come from. So this really helps because it helps us do what we call command and control. So what command and control means is when a threat actor is essentially trying to get control of a specific system and then make changes to it as needed. So if like, yeah, I think we all get the picture here. Network traffic, we already talked about that. System logs, we talked about that. Endpoint logs, we also talked about that. All of these are different log types that give us information about what exactly happened. So if I were to talk about logs overall, they're really important for cybersecurity because then we can do a lot more investigative work when we have a lot more data of what happened when. These logs track everything from authentication logs, firewall logs, application logs. All of these logs are just looking at all of our different systems on our network that are that tell us what exactly happened. Now, when you're looking at logs, you might be asking yourself, what exactly am I looking for? What is something that is actually important for me to look for? Well, the first thing you need to understand is the type of log you're looking at. Whether you're looking at authentication log or firewall log, all of these are going to look different. So here's an example. Here is a firewall log example. Now, in the firewall log example, it's going to look a little wonky, but let me show you this. This is a website I've used very often when it comes to logs. Let me put it all here for you all to read. So essentially, log is going to have all of these different elements associated with it, right? Date, time, the host name, and whatnot. And then when you go into the log, you'll see this kind of like crazy mess. But you can decipher it by essentially saying, okay, well then let's kind of read this from left to right. This is the date, so we know that happened in 2021 in August the 30th, and this is the time in which it happened. Okay, so on this time, this specific network we're looking at, what is the type? It is a traffic, so this means we're looking at traffic data. This firewall log. Then we see the source. So this is the source IP. This is the person that's trying to get somewhere. Destination means that is the destination IP. So what is the rule here? We're trying to go from the internal to the DMZ. So we're going internal outwards. What port are we using? Well, we're trying to use this specific port, and we're trying to get to 443. Okay, this is how we read it, left to right. I won't go through all of this, but if you read it and if you break it down bit by bit, you'll essentially understand that this is the type of data that you're looking for that will inform your overall investigation. So you need to be familiar with what these things mean, what the different terminology is. But with AI nowadays, you just plant all of that data into AI and say, hey, find me anomalies. Now, is that fully reliable? No, because AI makes mistakes. However, it is one of the things that makes life a little easier for us. Baseline behavior, we've talked about that in the past, anything that might be an anomaly. And then user log analysis tool. So SIEM is the most important one here. With user log analysis, that's just using SIEM systems. A good one that you will run into and that you should know is Splunk. So I think you all will run through this in one of your labs at some point. If you haven't, you should check out Splunk. It's also a really good company to work for. Then we have one of the things you want to look for in this log data is IOCs, so indicators of compromise. When you're looking at indicators of compromise, you're looking at different domain names like hackerlobby.com or something like that, different file hashes, any IP addresses that fall in certain abnormalities. That's exactly what we're looking for here, is any abnormalities or anything that falls out of the ordinaries. So anything that falls out of line, like a really high spike in traffic, or maybe data exfiltration signs, such as like someone is trying to exfil like 100 gigs of data on a Wednesday at 4 a.m. That is unusual activity. You also want to correlate these events across logs. So if you're looking at, let's say, a network, a firewall log, and it's seeing that there's an exfiltration attempt, you're looking at authentication log, seeing that there's someone trying to log in at 3 a.m. And then you're looking at application log, seeing that a certain database application is taking out a lot of data. You correlate all of that together to find out what exactly happened in between all of them that paints a picture of that incident. So when you look for that pattern and that relationship, that feeds into your investigation overall. Obviously, even though this comes at the end, we always talk about how we don't document at the end, we document throughout. That means we look and we write down what we found, why it looks suspicious. We do like what steps we took. An easy way to do this documentation step throughout is to screen record and take screenshots. When you screen record what you're doing on the computer, you can go back, review it later, and then write it all out. Nowadays, there are a lot of really cool tools out there. For example, I knew someone who worked in incident response. What they would do is the minute an incident would happen, they would start recording on a voice note on their work phone, and they'd say, I'm currently doing this, I'm currently doing this, it's this time, I looked at this log looks suspicious. And then they're recording it on their computer as well. So they're verbally saying what they're doing so that it gets transcribed. Really, really cool stuff. So these are all the ways you can interpret and look at logs. If I were to summarize all of this, I would just say you need to look for the patterns that are abnormal in the logs, and then you need to document all of it. That's it. Look for abnormal stuff. So what are some other data sources that would be relevant here? Well, for one, there are vulnerability scans that you can do. So when you do a vulnerability scan, it's important because this scan will essentially it'll essentially identify some key points. One of the key points it can identify is the entry point. So it can say, hey, this is the weakness that we didn't patch. This is a weakness or a misconfiguration in our network. And this is how the attacker was able to break in. The vulnerability displays the weakness to us. And then it helps us prioritize on what exactly we should focus on. I'll go back to prioritization a little later on. Oh, I've got some questions. Jignesh says, are notes also part of the evidence that needs to be preserved? Yes, Jignesh. When you take notes and when you document things, you need to make sure that that documentation process does not get tampered with. And then Kosi says, fully agreed, Kosi. Fully agreed. Okay. Carrying on here. And then there's detection and exploitation weaknesses. Vulnerability scans, they just display the weakness. That's what they do. No worries, Kosi. That's why I went along with it. All good. All right. And then automated reports. This can be an automation, if you remember. Now, you can automatically generate like summaries and insights from all these different resources by creating a system where, let's say, you take your SIEM, you take your firewall, your antivirus, put it in one and say, hey, give me a report. So this is good because it saves time, it does the notification efficiently, and then it does efficient detection and analysis. So this is really a really nice and automated way to send a notification to a human in order to review. More often than not, this will typically come in the form of a dashboard because all of the reporting, it can be sent to an email or one person, or you can see a dashboard that will show you in real time how everything, the health of everything, if there's any spikes anywhere. It essentially puts a visual data to it. Now, this is important because the visual data of a dashboard is really helpful for C-suite executives and stakeholders to be able to see how exactly they can respond or make decisions. Here is an example of a Splunk incident response dashboard. So the dashboard is typically, if you didn't know, they typically are with a black background. So now that you work in cybersecurity, you are obligated to make your desktop have night mode. You're obligated to make it black. It's just a requirement working in cybersecurity. If you make it white and you show this to a cybersecurity professional, they'll essentially be blinded. I promise you. So the dashboard here, it'll give you like certain analytics. So you have like the list of here, where's your security posture, all of that. It'll show your risk score. It'll show your attack timeline. If you see a spike here, yes, Keith, dark mode forever and ever. This is essentially the dashboard that you'll get. And the dashboards are important because it gives you visualization. And a lot of these tools, they tend to also have customization. So you can pick the certain assets or the certain type of things you want to display. So those are other data types. And then packet captures, in very simple terms, packet captures is when you capture like internet traffic from a specific location. That's all it is. I won't delve into that one too much because I would say the ones that you see most often is dashboards, reports, and then scans to find out where the weaknesses are. Sure, if you've captured a certain piece of information on the traffic, that is helpful, but I've seen this more often. All right. I do want to spend some time talking about risk because when you approach incident response with risk in mind, that means prioritization. That means that you want to spend your time and effort on the things that really, really matter. What does that mean? It's like if you were a hospital, right, and the hospital had a bunch of patients that came in. One hospital, there is a husband that comes in and he says, "Oh, I have a runny nose, I have a cold, and I'm just so tired and hungry, and I need some soup." But then you have another person who is pregnant and they're about to deliver. Two very different people, right? So for us men who tend to fall apart when we get a little cold, well, then that's obviously not as big of a priority as someone who's about to deliver. So the same thing happens in cybersecurity. You need to prioritize your time and your resources for the things that are very, very important. Well, one of the ways that you can do that is through risk assessment. That means that you proactively find out all of the assets that are most important to you and your system, to you and your business to operate. That means you look at what data is important, what systems are important, what services do we need in order for our business to continue to function. This is called a business continuity plan, meaning that you know exactly what to do to make sure your business operates. In order to do that, you need to identify the critical assets. From there, you need to ask some very specific questions. You need to do what we call a threat analysis. You say, okay, what could go wrong? Who might attack us? Where are we weak? You're approaching it from a risk standpoint to understand where are all the possible ways that we could be attacked so that you can protect against it. Typically, this threat analysis involves a vulnerability assessment, meaning you're doing a self-assessment to see where you might be at risk. And then you look at risk, meaning you do a risk evaluation. Now, the risk evaluation process measures two things. It is trying to measure the likelihood of that specific risk happening and the impact if that risk were to happen. Anyone who's thinking about joining cybersecurity, risk might be something you could get into. There's something as having a working in risk management. So when you work in risk management, well, then you're trying to understand those two elements. How likely is this thing to happen? And then how bad would it be if it were to happen? You put a risk number on it, and then you put a dollar amount to it because that is typically what they care about when it comes to impact. Now then, you would go into risk ranking. So you can rank something as high, medium, or low. High means that it could shut down the entire operations and it could have a legal implication. Medium means that it could disrupt the team, but not the whole organization. It could be like, hey, our website is down, which is a big deal, but we can still sell, we can still do our services, that kind of stuff. And low just means that it's minimal impact. It's like a phishing email, but no one clicked it. How frequent should a risk assessment be conducted? Is it event-driven or scheduled? Richard, that is an amazing question. And the answer is that it should be scheduled. If you're wanting to be a good company that has good security practices, well, then you want to do a risk assessment at least annually, at the very least. Some compliance standards, which we'll talk about in regulation in another class, require it on a quarterly basis. But these assessments are not supposed to be one and done. They should be continued. Now, when it comes to severity, we need to make sure we classify incidences into high, medium, or low based on the big impact it would have. And then we need to analyze the business impact. We need to understand, is there going to be a financial hit? Are we going to be out of compliance? Or is there going to be a reputational hit? Will our customers lose faith in us? Will we lose a bunch of followers on our Instagram and whatnot? You need to take all those into consideration. Then resource allocation. This is just like people, tools, time, energy. Where is that going into? We want to put all of that into our are big items. And then we also need to come up with a mitigation plan. That means that we need to put stronger controls on the things that matter more. So we need to make sure that we're having more monitoring on our critical systems. We need to make sure that our backups are fully up. Backups are so incredibly important to incident response. They should be one of the first things to be looked into. Then you have a response strategy. Now, with the response strategy, you need to, if you remember, we talked about different playbooks, incident response playbook. A playbook is a tailored list of things to do based off a specific incident. So that means you have a playbook from ransomware, you have a playbook for insider threat. These are different playbooks that you need to have prepared in case it were to happen. And then you need to make sure that you respond quickly, that you have a really fast response rate so that you limit the damage that happens. And that response rate requires a lot of communication and a lot of collaboration across departments. Remember, your CSIRT team is legal, security, IT, HR, all of them built into one. And then you obviously have to continually improve it. You can't just do a one and done. You have to learn from every single incident, do your lessons learned, what worked, what failed, what can we do to make it better. And you just constantly review that over and over and over again. Okay, now this is a kind of little bit of an intro to compliance. I am going to summarize this because we're going to spend a whole entire class on this. So I'm actually not going to spend too much time on this. These are the things that I will say though. Regulatory and compliance is related to this, GRC. GRC stands, oh, it was right there, but we'll back up. So GRC stands for governance, risk, and compliance. After I had my stint in incident response and overall cybersecurity, I went into GRC, which means that I specifically went into governance and regulatory compliance. All of that is fancy terminology to say I make sure that the companies I work for are operating at the highest security posture that they can by being compliant with different cybersecurity standards and regulations. These standards and regulations, they can be laws, they can be external entities that qualify a certain government or qualify a certain company. And there are a bunch of different regulations out there. The ones that are most relevant to everyone in the UK is GDPR. We talked about it in the past. GDPR stands for the General Data Protection Regulation. And in summary, it just means that you as a company have to know exactly how your data, how you're using people's data. And then people need to be able to change and manage it. Now, we'll talk about that a little later on in another class. HIPAA stands for the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. This is related to healthcare. Remember we talked about PII, personal identifiable information? Protected health information or personal health information is what HIPAA is trying to protect. Things such as what medication you're on, do you have a pacemaker, or what are all of the, do you have any sort of illnesses that could potentially put you at risk? This is the type of information it protects. PCI DSS, if you are holding any sort of payment card information, if you've ever given your credit card information to a company, well, then they have to obviously store that information securely and process it securely. So they have to have a bunch of cybersecurity controls to protect that. SOX is also one that's really, really big right now. It stands for the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. So the Sarbanes-Oxley Act was when a bunch of companies were not operating with integrity. So this is meant to keep them accountable. So it is something in relation to financial data, but because finances are attached to IT and security, they are interlinked. Let me just double check. I want to do a quick time check here. Okay. Yeah, we're good. We're good. And then we have ISO and NIST So, oh, sorry, we have NIST. It's a very common framework. We talked about that in the class before. There are some industry-specific ones, such as in finance, they have FINRA, which stands for Financial Industry Regulation Authority, or SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission. If you'll notice, there is a huge connection and correlation between finance industry and cybersecurity, because cybersecurity is tied to finances. If your cybersecurity controls aren't well situated, well, then you will lose financially. The idea with all these regulations and all these compliance standards that we're going through here is just that what they do is they force companies to be compliant with them, meaning that they are proactively setting all of their security controls in place. When you become non-compliant with any of these, there are serious consequences that come into play, such as fines, lawsuits, and maybe even loss of public trust or finances. An example, with GDPR, if you become non-compliant with GDPR, well, then you as a company will incur a $20 million fine or a 4% fine of your entire revenue. And 4% for business could be millions, depending on how big the business is. So regulatory compliance is a really great field because it is growing right now. Obviously, you need the technical chops to be able to talk to the IT team, but you also need to be able to monitor and work through data and whatnot. It's a really great field. I really enjoyed my time there. All right, now that we've talked through all that, let us do this little case study. We're not going to spend too much time on it. Now, this case study is very simple. We're going to use everything that we learned in incident response in this real life scenario. So in short, I'll summarize all of this in short. So you're a subject matter expert when it comes to incident response, and you're working at a retail chain. So recently, the organization is forming its incident response capabilities, and these are some things that you noticed. So they have a round-the-clock monitoring. All noteworthy events are escalated to the makeshift. They meet the criteria for classified as incidences and to assess their severity. It looks like there's at least a semblance of foundation in place. So the IT team has followed security best practices, tuning the log endpoints, subnetting different departments, subnetting the different departments, and then enabling event log forwarding. However, you identify some misconfigurations that have not been set up and deem the organization not fully mature. So, case answers. Do me a favor, and in the case answers thread, please let me know, can you identify what gaps are in the current incident handling process? Can you give recommendations on how to fix these gaps? So I'll give you all a moment to read. I'm going to scroll out a little bit here to read this entire situation. And note, I will just give you all a little hint here, any of the things that they should change. There are 2 sentences here that should give you a really, really big clue. What are some gaps and what are the recommendations of what they should change? Give you all a minute to put your answers in. All right, let's check it out. Some people are saying, no CISO team with roles and responsibilities defined. Yes, very well done, Amir. Updates, define roles, backups, nope. Ben says no IRP, that is great, good find. Martial says same thing, no plan, no playbook, no preparation on any incident response, missing IRP, no incident response, no logs, lack of an established and documented IRP, no baseline. Everyone is hitting the nail on the head. You all are absolutely correct. For one, my biggest pet peeve, there's no documentation. No documentation of baseline. There's no documentation of roles of responsibility. There is no formal process. because they're saying it's all ad hoc. So they don't have a formal incident response plan because it's ad hoc. Now, I could go on forever based on this paragraph. There are about, I don't know, 6 different things that they could do here. But I think all of you are hitting the nail on the head. There's really nothing defined, everything should be kind of like brought from the ground up. Thank you, Alfin. So yeah, great job. All right, let's go ahead and take a quick quiz here. Quiz thread. So, question 1. A retail company detects unusual traffic spikes in its internal network late at night, while reports of customer data being exposed. Their incident response team immediately begins isolating affected systems, analyzing the logs, and restores services from backup. However, a week later, they experience a similar breach due to the same vulnerability. What was the most likely flaw in the incident response process? A, B, C, or D? Everyone says A. That is correct. So in this scenario, they followed all the right steps afterwards, but they did not identify, they did not properly detect and identify. So they didn't properly identify the threat. Very good job, everyone. Question number 2. You're part of the CSIRT team and suspect an insider threat. The system admin hands you a USB drive. They image themselves from a suspect's workstation. They tell you they used basic file copy techniques to extract files of interest and didn't use a write blocker. No documentation was created during the process. Which of the following is the most significant reason this evidence may be inadmissible in court? Remember, I used that example. Everyone is saying C. That is correct. So because there was no write blocker, remember, a write blocker is something that prevents you from changing or tampering the information. That is correct. Question number 3. A legal team begins filtering and reviewing emails before placing a legal hold on the account. Which e-discovery principle is most likely being violated before placing a legal hold? A, B, C, or D? The data was not preserved before review. That is correct. So you do need to preserve it. Remember, there is the concept of preserving it. So like that crab I was talking about, and then collecting it. Great job, everyone. Question number 4. A security analyst receives a real-time alert about suspicious outbound traffic to an unknown IP address. To investigate further, which combination of data sources would be most effective? Suspicious outbound traffic, unknown IP address, outbound traffic. All right, that is correct, everyone. We are looking for network traffic because it's talking about outbound traffic and it's talking IP addresses. So no, it's IP related. And last but not least, final question. During an incident response, the team needs to investigate whether a suspicious outbound connection was part of a data exfiltration attempt. Which data source would best support detailed analysis of the actual data being transmitted? A, B, C, or D? Everyone says C. That is correct. It is packet captures. Good job, everyone. Okay, so we talked about a lot of things. We talked about incident response, the different phases of incident response, and how data essentially feeds incident investigations. So one of the things I definitely want you to remember is the incident response lifecycle. Remember, it's broken down into 5 phases. There's preparation, detection and analysis, containment and eradication, recovery, and lessons learned. So the incident response lifecycle is something you do have to memorize because it is going to be something you'll run into in your cybersecurity career. We talked about digital forensics and how it's really important to acquire, preserve, analyze it, and how data feeds everything. We talked about how data is like one of the biggest key elements when it comes to evidence. So we need to know how to collect that data, where to collect that data. We talked about logs, network logs, authentication logs, application logs, about how logs are the diary of a system. And the diary of that system essentially give us breadcrumbs to understand the incident as a whole and then be able to give it a picture. We talked about how the entire incident response process is very closely related to cybersecurity and to crimes and working with legal teams, working with lawyers, working in court. So your work is directly going to be applicable to these formats. So we talked about how with this, we all need to work more proactively. We need to have the right people, processes. We need to have the right plans in place. We need to have the right structure in order to react properly. The best way to react to an incident is to be as prepared as possible.